Every cognitive bias explained. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias refers to the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information received, the anchor, when making decisions or judgments. This bias can lead individuals to make choices that are unduly influenced by the initial anchor, even when subsequent information contradicts or outweighs the relevance of the anchor. The availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that involves basing judgments or decisions on information that comes to mind most easily, typically due to its vividness, recency, or frequency. People tend to overestimate the likelihood of events or situations that are more easily recalled or imagined, potentially leading to inaccurate assessments and decisions. Bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is a psychological phenomenon where people tend to adopt certain beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors because others around them are doing the same. It stems from the desire to conform and follow the crowd, as well as the perception that the popular choice must be the correct or beneficial one. Base rate fallacy. The base rate fallacy occurs when people fail to consider the base rate or general probability of an event when making judgments or predictions. Instead, they focus on specific situational information, even when it contradicts or is less relevant than the base rate data. Bias blind spot. The bias blind spot is the tendency for individuals to recognize cognitive biases in others while being unaware of or underestimating their own biases. People often believe they are more objective and less susceptible to biases than they actually are, making it challenging to identify and correct their own biased thinking. Choice supportive bias. Choice supportive bias is the tendency to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to an option or decision after it has been made, while overlooking or downplaying the flaws in the chosen alternative. This bias helps people feel more confident and satisfied with their choices, even when the decision may have been suboptimal. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the inclination to seek out, interpret, and prioritize information that aligns with and reinforces existing beliefs or hypotheses, while dismissing or downplaying contradictory evidence. This bias can lead to a distorted and one-sided view of reality. Conservatism bias. Conservatism bias, also known as the status quo bias, is the tendency to prefer and maintain the current state of affairs, even in the face of potentially beneficial changes or alternatives. This bias stems from a preference for familiarity and a resistance to change. Contrast effect. The contrast effect is a cognitive bias that occurs when the perception of something is influenced by its comparison to a contrasting object or situation. For example, a person may seem more attractive when compared to an unattractive person, or a salary may seem higher when compared to a lower-paying job. Declinism. Declinism is the tendency to view the past in an overly positive light and perceive the present or future as being in a state of decline or deterioration. This cognitive bias can lead to nostalgia, pessimism about current circumstances, and a romanticized view of historical eras. Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which individuals with low ability or knowledge tend to overestimate their own competence, while those with higher ability or knowledge tend to underestimate their own competence. This bias can lead to a paradoxical situation where the least skilled individuals are the most confident in their abilities. Endowment effect. The endowment effect is the tendency to ascribe greater value to items or possessions simply because they belong to the individual. People tend to demand a higher price to sell an item they own than they would be willing to pay to acquire the same item if they did not own it. Framing effect. The framing effect is a cognitive bias that describes how people's decisions or perceptions can be influenced by the way information is presented or framed. The same information, when framed differently, for example emphasizing gains or losses, can lead to different choices or interpretations. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that if a particular event or outcome has occurred more frequently than expected in the past, it is less likely to occur in the future, or vice versa. This fallacy stems from a misunderstanding of probability and the belief that future events are influenced by past events in a random process. Halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where an initial positive impression or single trait colors the perception of an entire person, object, or situation. For example, someone who is physically attractive may be perceived as more intelligent or trustworthy, even without evidence to support those assumptions. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, also known as the knew-it-all-along effect, is the tendency to perceive past events as more predictable than they were before they occurred. After an event has happened, people often convince themselves that they had foreseen or anticipated the outcome, even if they did not. Illusion of control. The illusion of control is a cognitive bias that leads people to believe they have more control over events or outcomes than they actually do. This bias can manifest in situations where there is a perception of skill or influence, even when the outcome is largely determined by chance or external factors. Illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect is the tendency to believe that a statement or claim is true simply because it has been repeated frequently or is familiar. Repeated exposure to information, regardless of its accuracy, can make it seem more plausible or believable over time. Fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overemphasize personal characteristics or dispositions as the cause of someone's behavior, while underestimating the influence of situational or external factors. This bias can lead to unfair judgments or assumptions about others' motivations or actions. Self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute positive outcomes or successes to personal qualities or efforts, while attributing negative outcomes or failures to external factors or circumstances beyond one's control. This bias serves to protect and enhance self-esteem and self-perception. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon where people tend to develop a preference or positive attitude towards something simply because they have been repeatedly exposed to it. This effect can influence preferences for various stimuli, including shapes, words, symbols, and even people. Negativity bias. The negativity bias is the tendency to give more attention and weight to negative information, events, or experiences than to positive ones. This bias can influence decision-making, memory, and perceptions, leading people to focus disproportionately on negative aspects or potential threats. Normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is the tendency to underestimate the likelihood or potential impact of disruptive or catastrophic events, and to assume that life will continue as normal. This bias can lead people to ignore or downplay warning signs and fail to take appropriate precautions or actions in the face of potential risks or disasters. Observational selection bias. Observational selection bias occurs when the sample of observations or data being studied is not representative of the entire population or phenomenon of interest. This bias can lead to inaccurate conclusions or generalizations because the observed data is skewed or incomplete. Omission bias. Omission bias is the tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or more unacceptable than equally harmful inactions or omissions. This bias can lead people to prefer inaction over action, even when taking action could prevent harm or produce benefits. Optimism bias. The optimism bias is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of positive events happening and underestimate the likelihood of negative events occurring. This bias can lead to unrealistic expectations, poor planning, and a failure to adequately prepare for potential risks or setbacks. Ostrich effect. The ostrich effect is the tendency to avoid or ignore potentially negative or unpleasant information or situations, even when ignoring them could have detrimental consequences. This bias stems from a desire to avoid discomfort or anxiety, but can lead to poor decision-making and missed opportunities. Outcome bias. Outcome bias is the tendency to judge a decision or action based on the outcome, rather than the quality of the decision-making process itself. Positive outcomes are often viewed as resulting from good decisions, while negative outcomes are seen as the result of poor decisions, regardless of the actual merits or reasoning behind the choices. Overconfidence bias. The overconfidence bias is the tendency to overestimate one's own abilities, knowledge, or chances of success, leading to excessive confidence and potentially poor decision-making or risk assessment. This bias can stem from a variety of factors, including a lack of self-awareness or a desire to maintain a positive self-image. Planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is the tendency to underestimate the time, effort, or resources required to complete a task or project, often leading to unrealistic plans and schedules. This bias stems from an optimistic outlook and a failure to account for potential obstacles or setbacks. Psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is the tendency to react in opposition to perceived threats or restrictions to one's freedom of choice or autonomy. When people feel their freedom is being limited, they may experience a motivational force to reassert their autonomy, sometimes leading to behavior that is contrary to their own beliefs or best interests.